If I could have your attention, please. I'd like to begin the program. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Tom Bevan. I'm co-founder and president of RealClearPolitics, and I'd like to thank you all for being here. We've got a great program for you today, Revitalizing American Industries. It's a very important topic. We have a distinguished panel of experts to discuss the topic, some excellent keynote interviews to be conducted, so I want to get right to it. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please mute your phones. Don't turn them off, though. We'd like you to go ahead and tweet. We've got a hashtag, American Industries RCP, so please feel free to take photos, tweet anything that you see and hear up here today, but please mute your phones so we don't interrupt the program. Before we actually get started, and I'm going to introduce Max Pappas from Google here in a minute, we'd like to watch a quick video, if I could direct your attention over to the monitor, about some of the work that Google is doing to help promote growth in the economy. Let's watch.
I served 8 years in the Army. When I got back from overseas, I decided it was time for me to test my skills out in the civilian world. And my fiancée Meredith helped drive me towards making my own beer. With what's available online, we were able to learn how to make the beer, craft a business plan, and do all the other things we needed to do to help people find us. Today, Service Brewing Company has 12 employees. About half of them are veterans. Hiring veterans helps with their transition into civilian life. We can provide them mentorship along the way. And we also have the mission to give back to charities that support service to your country and community. You know, it's a lot of work and a constant learning process. But we get inspired building something that makes a difference.
Whether you're a business owner, a veteran making the switch to a civilian profession, or just want to take the next step in your career, you can find free tools and training to grow your skills at google.com/grow.
And with that, I'd like to introduce Max Pappas. He is the Public Affairs Manager at Google. Max, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. I am Max Pappas, Public Policy Manager at Google in the DC office. And we're thrilled to partner with RealClearPolitics for this conversation on how we can put technology to work, revitalizing traditional industries like manufacturing and agriculture, to making the future of work work for everyone. Creating opportunities for everyone is one of Google's core values. And we're excited to deepen our commitment to bringing even more digital skills and economic opportunities to communities in the US. To support the men and women who have proudly served our country, Google recently launched a series of initiatives to help them transition to civilian jobs. From both my grandfathers coming back from World War II, to uncles coming back from Desert Storm, to my brother-in-law most recently coming back from Iraq, I know this transition can be challenging. So today I want to bring to your attention 3 of these initiatives that we're rolling out. First, a Google search tool that matches veterans' skills with opening jobs. 2, Google identifying veteran-led businesses. And 3, scholarships that we're providing to veterans and their spouses. So first, the Google search tool. Through Grow with Google, which is our initiative to help create opportunities for all Americans, we hope to use our technology to help veterans access the full range of opportunities open to them across many different fields. Right now, those opportunities are getting lost in translation. There isn't a common language that helps recruiters match a veteran's experience with the need for their skills and leadership in civilian jobs. As a result, 1 in 3 veterans of the roughly 250,000 service members who transition out of the military each year end up taking jobs well below their skill level. So starting today, service members can search jobs for veterans on Google and then enter their specific military job code to see relevant civilian jobs that require similar skills to those that they used in the military. Second, identifying veteran-led businesses. Rather than applying for a job at an existing company, some veterans might want to start their own. In fact, veteran-owned businesses make up almost 9% of all businesses in the United States. Businesses like the Service Brewing Company, the brewery from Savannah, Georgia, just featured in the video. As you heard, Kevin Ryan is a former Army commander who was stationed in Iraq and is responsible for the lives of over 300 people. After returning home, he decided to test his skills in the civilian world by working with his father in healthcare. And when his father passed, Ryan knew that he needed to find his own passion, and along with his fiancée and co-founder, Meredith Sutton, she persuaded him to make his own beer with the help of YouTube tutorials. So if anybody's thinking about making their own beer, you can find out how on YouTube. After that, they founded Service Brewing Company with the intention of the business giving back to veterans. And after just 3 years in business, Service Brewing Company has raised over $70,000 for organizations that assist first responders and veterans, and half of their staff are veterans. So to ensure that businesses like the Service Brewing Company are able to find customers who want to support veterans, and customers who want to support veterans can find jobs that are led and run by veterans, Google's offering a new attribute through Google My Business on Google Maps and Google Search mobile listings for businesses to identify as veteran-owned or led. You might have seen these. When you search for a company, you get a little box, and it's got the hours that they're open and their website and telephone number. And then there's a summary at the bottom with some key features. So a restaurant, for example, can put a little icon up that says that they have outdoor seating, or a hotel can put an icon up that says they're pet-friendly or have an indoor pool. Well, now, with this new feature, we've created an icon for veteran-led businesses to put up the icon on their summary box there, so you can see it right when you search their business to help drive business. It's pretty neat. Third, and lastly, digital skills scholarships for veterans. Learning digital skills is a big part of Grow with Google. So for transitioning military personnel, as well as military spouses, and veterans who want to develop a new skill, Google.org is giving a grant to the USO, the United Services Organizations, to provide training and career guidance and IT support. The $2.5 million grant will enable USO to incorporate the Google IT Support Professional Certificate into their programming. And there are currently more IT support jobs out there than qualified people. So this is a great opportunity. We want to help everyone across America, from those who make up the workforce today to those who will drive the workforce of tomorrow. We want to help them access the best of Google's training and tools to grow their skills, their careers, and their businesses. These are important issues, so I'm glad we're gathered here today to talk about this. And to facilitate this discussion around these topics today, I'd like to welcome to the stage today's moderator, the DC Bureau Chief of RealClearPolitics, Carl Cannon.
You'll notice I'm not alone. I'm bringing someone with me. Yeah, please take a moment, grab a seat. There's a few over here. You'll notice, do we turn our phones off?
No, I was just checking what jobs I could get as a veteran. I need to change my military MOS or I'm not getting a job.
Our guest today is a veteran. His name's Daryl Issa. Raised in Cleveland, Ohio, working class family. Enlisted in the U.S. Army, made the rank of captain before mustering out. Moved back to Cleveland, started a couple of high-tech companies there, Quantum Enterprises and Steel Stopper.
With an A.
Yeah, with an A.
No,
Steel Stopper. It's
no
an
aluminum or steel.
anti-car theft device. In the mid-'80s, he moved to California as I was moving here to Washington. Can you see me? I kind of have my back to you. How's that? Better?
Hey, John.
And where he started in another, he settled in the then sleepy city of Vista. That's a little strong, but it wasn't as big as it is now.
The thriving metropolis of San Diego and its surrounding rolling hills.
All right. And he started another company called Directed Electronics. I'm pretty sure I heard your voice before I ever heard of you or you went into politics. I have a little surprise. I'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, it's what you think.
Yeah.
And I think I first talked to him when you were president of the Consumer Electronics Association. I was the regional reporter here in Washington for the San Jose Mercury News.
You still had braces back then.
Covering a beat.
Acne, you're a teenager.
Covering a beat we called high tech, right? But the San Jose Mercury News was the unofficial organ of Silicon Valley. Darrell Issa won a seat to Congress in 2000. He was here, first year here was 9/11, and you've pretty much, you never lost your interest in technology, but you pretty much participated in every spirited partisan fight we've had in this town since then, and some that aren't partisan.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to miss a good fight. How many people thought Sopa Pippa was worth fighting over?
See?
Okay, I got, you did? I'm shocked.
All right, but that thing about, I think I heard your voice. Zach, are you able to cue something up for me? I think this is you.
I don't know. We're going to find out whether under copyright law this is fair sampling.
Viper armed. Protected by Viper. Stand back.
See why I went into politics. I got a voice for print.
Viper. No one dares come close.
Viper armed, protected by Viper.
That is the old Darrell. You have the new, kinder, gentler Darrell. I would just call the police and tell them the car is on its way down the highway. I would not put a snake in the car any longer.
All right,
It was too hard on the snakes.
In all seriousness, though, those Viper ads, you've seen them, they show this sketchy-looking car thief and a snake, the Viper, but that was an older form of theft. At that time, you were starting your third high-tech company, what we call, but did you ever imagine that the internet would create an entire class of thieves who would steal more than cars? That China, for instance, would send someone here, this happened this summer, to get a job with Apple computers so it could steal the technology for self-driving cars, so it could steal the whole way to manufacture cars. Did you see this coming?
Well, the answer is sort of. You know, I saw people essentially running phone lines and dialing every single line to find out which ones were faxes so they could send you spam. That was already happening. I saw, if you will, people here and around the world dialing up for a modem, and when they got a modem, seeing if they could pull anything off of whatever computer was behind that. That was going on. Did I think that the speed of transfer was going to allow terabytes to be stolen? No, that only Moore's law would tell you that was going to happen. And I think the second part of it, which was more insidious, we never really were thinking that next step ahead, that a company in China would put inside your modem chip, which still exists, you know, in any kind of a switching system. They'd put inside it an algorithm that allows them at will to essentially go into every single computer with those products somewhere in their hardware and steal anything they want. So I don't think we thought about sort of the organized, government-backed, high-tech, vast amount of stealing. When I came into Congress, we were thinking about people using your copyright, you know, clandestinely. We thought about people dialing up your modem and trying to see if they could hack whatever was behind it. Nobody really thought about government-based, organized theft at the scale that we see in a few countries. China, you already mentioned.
Early this summer at our first event sponsored by Google, we had a panelist named Rusty Justice. Is that a great name? Rusty Justice.
Well, I think if he went to law review and you know, he could probably be less rusty in his justice. Well,
he was actually came up as a coal miner, then became a coal engineer, left the coal industry and started in Pikesville, Kentucky, in the heart of Appalachia, a company to teach out-of-work coal miners how to code. Oh. And he's got this little hung out of shingle, he's making a living, but he told us this harrowing story of there's another company in his town, or it's nearby, and they communicate, but they have a completely separate system for communicating with the outside world. Their internal system, nobody can
Right.
access it. And he said that if they went, it'd be easier for him to go online, it'd be easier to communicate and sell and do things, but that if they did that, Chinese hackers would steal his trade secrets in 2 weeks. He said our product would be on the open market for sale in 6 months. This is the middle of Appalachia. I mean, so here's a guy using technology that we're here to talk about today, create jobs, and a country, 7,000 miles away can go in the heart of Appalachia and steal it. What's the answer to this?
Well, according to the president, it's tariffs.
Well, I was going to get to that.
Well, but I bring it up for a reason. You've got to have a response to an individual criminal element. The guy sitting there in flip-flops, dialing up, so to speak. And, we have an FBI, and they go in and they raid him. But if that person's in another country, well, then we need laws where their FBI goes in and raids them. But if it's, in fact, the government condoning or even doing it on military bases with government-paid employees, then we have to have a reaction that we currently don't have. We don't have a United Nations that will sanction directly for this kind of activity. And we don't have a protocol for cyber response. And that's both destructive cyber and theft. And we're feeling our way currently, Congress, the president, even the ITC, all of government is trying to figure out what is the measured response, because we have it in other areas, we don't have it in the cyber world right now. Tariffs are not without being a potential element of we can economically hurt you if you won't play by the global rules. Now that cuts both ways, so let's remember that we've lost in the WTO at times too, but it is important to ask, if not the current posture of the president and the administration, then what is the answer to something that's been pervasive for a couple of decades now?
Do you think the president announced these, he ran on it. I mean, it wasn't a shock that he was thinking of this. I mean, and this engineer I was talking about from Kentucky, this coal engineer turned a high-tech entrepreneur, said he was a free trader and he was uncomfortable with the idea of tariffs, but he was glad someone was sticking up for American intellectual property rights. Do you think the president should have given, what other presidents would do in a case like that, given a major policy address, maybe to both sets of Congress, prime time, and really laid out the case against China before enacting these tariffs and really tried to bring public opinion with him more than he did? Maybe he thought it was already there, but he didn't make the case very, very well.
Well, and everyone can have a completely different opinion. Mine's based on the decades that I've been involved, both on the government and the private side, because I remained on the board of my company for many, many years while I was here in Congress. And, it became so normal that even though my former company was manufacturing products in China, my CEO had to drive past a building that in the largest print possible had some of our names on it because they had decided to make knockoffs of our products. Now, it was bad enough they were knocking them off in China and selling them in China, but then they showed up in Singapore and Taiwan, and in a couple of cases, the company, the board of directors, and I was on it, made a decision to abandon registered trademarks that we had here because their global image had gotten so bad. Obviously, we took a different stance on, Polk and Definitive and Marantz and Denon, ones that we were willing to defend at great expense. But that's not the new normal. That's 2 decades of normal. So the question is, if we hadn't gotten to where everyone in this room knew that China and other countries, I often say China and India just to balance it with almost 3 billion people out of 7, they're just flat unfair traders. They're corrupt at all levels, and they do not respect your intellectual property. Now, if you don't know it, you're not going to know it because the president makes a speech. What I think is interesting, and I think all of us, because I made a speech just after the president, the day he was sworn in, to the technology community, and I told them, look, you're going to be surprised at a guy who built buildings who doesn't really understand any part of technology. He's not a techie at all, He was using a flip phone when I met him, very effectively too, by the way. But that he understands money and he understands right and wrong, and he's going to react. I don't think any of us thought that a very esoteric national security 232 provision was going to allow commerce to do a tariff so quickly. But because he discovered that, and because it's almost as quick as an order signed by one person, not even the president, it was inevitable that we were going to end up acting much quicker than somebody who thinks they have to get a consensus from Congress to begin doing this. I'm going to be the tech, but I'm also going to be a Trump supporter in a sense. If we went to Congress, Congress probably would have given the president an awful lot of sanctions. You could have gotten Republicans and Democrats to actually be shamed into putting tariffs in. But that would be like Smoot-Hawley. It would not be a strategy that could be turned on and turned off. The current strategy has one benefit that all of us in tech need to both want and lobby for. And that is that when we get a deal, we've got to take it and turn off the tariffs as fast as they were turned on, because that's the only way these tools are effective. Long-term tariffs always, always hurt economies.
Let me ask you about a third country, not China or
We can
India.
do Brazil.
No, this is a country in Europe. Part of it's in Europe. If hackers, China and India are trying to steal everything that Americans invent, why is it beyond the president's grasp that Vladimir Putin might want to use his government's cadre of hackers to steal an election or wreak other kinds of havoc in the United States? This doesn't seem like such a stretch.
Yeah, and this is a great political question. It's not a particularly techie question. We already have huge sanctions on Russia for their actions, including shutting down the grids and going in with what they call little green men, military force, after they shut down portions of Ukraine and Georgia. They clearly have done this. The president's briefed on it. What's interesting, and it goes back to your earlier point, if you look back, the Obama administration had this knowledge apparently for the whole administration, that these activities over the 4 to 8 years of the previous administration were being seen covertly and so on. So one of the questions is, why is it that the last administration wasn't willing to bring it to a head? Why is it that there was constant sort of, well, we've got to work with Russia? And the answer is as old, at least as Eisenhower and certainly Reagan, and that is, you've got to work with these people in Russia, the old Soviet Union, as though they're not bad because you need them for stability around the world. And then you have to find ways to sanction them because they are bad. And we have done that through president after president, negotiated, worked with them when we could, and sanctioned them. And that's the status quo we are right now. Russia has huge sanctions on it. They're remaining in place. Some of them were put on by this administration. And at the same time, we cannot end the problems and the slaughter in southern Syria as long as the air defenses of Russia are protecting Bashar Assad's forces. And that's just one little part of the world, but there's lots of those.
Let me bring the Russia thing back to tech a little. There's an Arizona State professor named Joel Garrow who used to work at the Washington Post. He's a futurist, and he calls specifically, he's referring to Russian disinformation, but this whole idea of disinformation on the internet, an attack on the Enlightenment is how he looks at it. He said if there are no factual baselines, and this is what Facebook has now been forced to have to try and modulate, then there's
It may go to MSNBC someday.
But if there's no factual baselines, it's hard to have a reasoned argument, and democracy depends on that. You don't disagree with that?
Actually, I do.
Okay.
How many lawyers are in the room? I mean, look at that. This is only in Washington will they admit it. Look, lawyers come into court with two truths. They can't both be true. And juries spend a lot of time dealing with BS from both lawyers, overspin, and it doesn't matter whether it's civil or criminal. the combatant nature of partisan output, your facts, my facts, your statistics, my statistics, none of that's going away. Where we have to find certain discipline is how we define those terms. In other words, is the editorial page the only place you'll find opinion in the Wall Street Journal? Well, Wall Street Journal is better than most at trying to keep opinion on the opinion page and fact on the fact pages. That's one of the challenges we have in a lot of emerging technologies and even in some of these legacy systems, is that they're blurring the two. I do not think that facts are ever going to be settled except by two groups, each presenting their views or more, and having a healthy opportunity for people to figure out that somebody is slanting the truth in order to get an outcome that isn't necessarily true. And that's not new. So it's not that I don't want the truth. It's not that I can't take the truth. It's that I think that we have to understand that we're always going to have a debate and people are going to pull out the facts they want. There is a challenge right now in the tech world, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, and that is if we're dealing with, quote, shutting down things that aren't true, is it only conservative thought that isn't true? Is there an 80-20 ratio of one side being shut down versus another? That is dangerous, because complete free speech can be dangerous, but selective free speech has to be analyzed for, are the rules so easily understood and so defined that you can make sure that they're not selectively picking winners and losers based on an ideology. And currently, my party is convinced that many of these platforms are in fact using the, quote, it's just an algorithm as an excuse to shut down one form of speech as unacceptable. You know, the greatest debate there is in the world today is the settled debate about climate change. Climate change is settled, period. Well, you know, we've had all kinds of truisms, including where the first man came and what the history of all kinds of things were, that have been turned upside down time and time again. No science should ever be settled, and yet if the internet decides that anyone who says it isn't getting warm as fast as somebody else is a heretic and takes it off, then we lose the opportunity to actually question science for better results. So it's not just politics, it's all kinds of things where we have to have either a free exchange or defined rules where the public can analyze whether or not there's a bias and make decisions.
After the 2016 election, as you know, Facebook came under pressure. I submit to you that CNN and these other cable news that gave Donald Trump an open microphone, maybe they should have been under some pressure, but Facebook was. At Facebook's annual shareholder meeting last May, some critic of Zuckerberg's hired a plane with one of those banners and it flew overhead and it said, "You broke democracy." Two questions about that. Is democracy broken? Three, I guess, based on what you said. Second question is Mark Zuckerberg the guy to blame for it? And three, is the corrective going to be worse than what happened in 2016? This corrective that you've been talking about.
Well, the term yellow journalism is something you had to learn growing up in this industry. What is yellow journalism?
Sensationalism.
But it's also basically biased newspapers. William Randolph Hearst ran a newspaper syndicate that picked winners and losers politically before I was born. And he ran it very successfully. My hometown newspaper, the San Diego Union Tribune, was owned by conservative Republicans for a generation.
I worked for them, Jim Copley.
Right, and Jim Copley couldn't save Nixon, but he never allowed a bad picture to be printed. He hired Herb Klein when he left the White House and kept Herb on until his
former White House communications director.
Right, his last days. So there's nothing wrong, and there's nothing historically wrong in viewpoints, a more conservative newspaper or a less conservative newspaper. There is a challenge when you have essentially monopolies. anytime you have a monopoly, it ends up having to be questioned of whether it should be regulated like a utility with a different lack of bent. And the success of Facebook puts them in this odd situation in which if they have a bent, then how do you bend back to create a balance?
One second. A couple more questions. They're rushing me, but I will not be rushed.
You won't be Russian? Come on, folks. I got to lighten up a little.
Take it out of the next guy's time. Here he is.
Hey, I don't know how to tell you this, brother, but I'm on your time. You know, you didn't show up, so you were first.
All right, I'll try.
Time just takes over, doesn't it? Yeah.
Okay.
All right,
this gentleman has a microphone. We better get to him quick.
All right. I got 2 or 3 more, and then we'll take some from the audience.
Okay.
So
we could just have Doug come up here and answer some of these.
We'll be
He's
good.
so much fun. You got different questions for Doug?
Yes, I do.
Doug, you don't get the Russian questions, lucky dog.
There are more lines of code in the new Ford F-150 that's coming out, with aluminum, by the way, instead of steel. Takes 750 pounds out of it, but I digress.
Well, not only that, you're about 6 years past when they put the aluminum in.
No, the new one. The new one.
But they already put the aluminum body,
well,
and they already took 700. Take another 700 off?
Well, maybe I'm thinking of the Ford Ranger they're bringing back. Anyway, there's more lines of code in it than the F-16. And this was, and
see, better software has less code that works better.
Well, but these traditional industries have...
How many coders here that look and don't count the number of lines of code as success?
Oh, come on.
It's how much you do with how few lines of code.
You're filibustering now.
I am.
All right.
I'm dating myself, too.
That's all right. But here's what I want to ask you about, because these traditional industries have done pretty good incorporating the digital economy. But some are fighting it, and the ones who are fighting it are fighting the peer-to-peer economy. You are co-founder of the Congressional Sharing Economy Caucus, and I want to ask you what you make of the opposition to companies like Uber and Airbnb.
Well, look, some companies are in conventional industries that are used to having monopolies. The cab companies had monopolies, so we understand why cabbies objected to it until in large numbers they began deserting their cab companies to become Uber drivers. Last night or this morning I was on in an Uber, but he had 4 different software packages, including obviously Uber and Lyft. He worked off of why? Well, because he enjoyed the benefits of an economy that gave him something that no cab company could give him, no grocery delivery company could give him, no company could give him until there were multiple software companies that empowered him to make a living and to make choices, including, and he told me about this, he said, I keep Lyft because they take prepaid credit cards, which Uber doesn't. And I keep Uber because they let me navigate home, picking up jobs as I'm going home, because in order to compete, they didn't just give him an occupation, they let him go all the way to Galveston from Houston and then say, but I want to be home in 4 hours, and every pickup he had after that got him closer to home rather than random. This kind of innovation doesn't happen in stodgy old monopolies. So is there a penetration? Absolutely. Does it take time? Absolutely. Will we be better for it? Absolutely. When it comes to Airbnb, the fact is that's direct competition with hotels, and there is a viable, legitimate question for whether businesses that accommodate people should have some form of the same rules of the road. But it has nothing to do with the software. If you're Marriott, you'd better darn well have your software every bit as good as Airbnb, or you're not going to get guests. So they're doing a favor on the software side. There is a legitimacy to, if your neighbor has a bachelor party and it disrupts your life, you're asking, is Airbnb operating a business to my detriment against zoning? But that part of it is societal. It's not really the facilitator. Airbnb is doing something that's great for an industry. It's forcing everybody to improve their game for where and how I choose to stay.
You also helped found the Internet of Things caucus in the House.
It's been fun, too.
Yeah, and I'm from San Francisco, and I think of the Internet of Things. What's the Congress role there? What are you trying to do? Educate your colleagues, I assume.
Well, all caucuses are designed to educate your colleagues, to bring people in to help grow that. We do it mostly through educating staff who then are, in fact, the artificial intelligence of Congress. Oh, you know this one. You know, the congressman makes the following statement written by a staff who actually knew what he was going to say.
Well, then who's to blame when Orrin Hatch looks at Zuckerberg and says, wait a minute, Facebook doesn't charge money to users, how does it make a profit? So that was a failure of the Internet of Things.
Not everyone can get a 10% tithing out of their constituents. But the fact, though, is that we have to educate, but we also have to recognize that at a time in which there are privacy questions at Google, at Facebook, at Twitter, there's all kinds of those questions. You also have a new emerging technology that needs to be not regulated. As a matter of fact, it needs to be facilitated. The growth of artificial intelligence, making an automobile that is smarter, and putting in voice commands, your eye recognition, all the things that can happen. If we try to regulate it, it will speed up its progress as fast as healthcare, which, by the way, we need to extend patents just so they can get a return on their 20-year investment. We need to make sure that innovation keeps going as fast as it is. So we're also educating that the Internet of Things is going to happen unless we get in the way and slow it down. And right now, we're not getting in the way, we're not slowing it down, other than we're not providing enough free and available bandwidth. But with the exception of a fairly small portion that we must do, mostly we need to stay out of the way, and that's the lesson.
All right, I really am in the Doug Collins time here, so can I ask you for a 30-second answer to patent reform? You've been working on this for years. What's going to be your legacy there?
Well, I always say my legacy is what I did in my first couple Congresses, which was patent pilot, which got additional expertise and the ability for less judges to take more cases. And that still has improved the outcome in the Article III courts when you are in a patent dispute. And I think that's the most important thing that you can do on the back end. On the front end, we've improved patent quality, but we have to improve the re-examination process. PTAB, the ex parte re-examination process, is good, but it can be better, and we're working right now. Where's John? He's somewhere here. Where's
John whom?
Stand up and just tell him what you do.
Hi, I'm John Lee. I'm a judge in the PTAB, but currently on detail with the House of Representatives this year. And I'm helping the chairman
John's legacy, not my legacy, John's legacy, is going to be coming into Congress with the expertise of actually having had these cases, looking at what worked and didn't work, and go, I'd like to be better. There's a reason that PTAB almost never allows you to amend your claims. Well, if you go into an ex parte re-examination, you almost always come out with something, even if you've had to change the claims, strike an independent claim, and so on. We want to harmonize those. And so my legacy will be to leave John and people who have draft legislation, who have a good idea, who recognize that in the next Congress, inshallah, as they say in the Arab world, we will pass legislation that will take that next step toward getting any patent that isn't good enough when it comes out because we didn't know enough. When we know more information, allowing it to be reasonably amended rather than a gotcha game of you've got a good patent, but your certainty isn't any good if there's one thing you missed, and anyone can miss something.
All right, that leaves my
30 seconds, would I do it?
No, you didn't, but that's all right. Last question, you mentioned Congress. You're retiring from Congress, although not from life, and I expect to hear from you in the future, but since we're Real Clear Politics, let me ask this question. What are the chances Republicans will manage to hold on to California's 49th district? And is your district a bellwether for control of Congress as a whole?
No, my district isn't particularly a bellwether. President Trump lost it by 8 points. You know, your bellwether typically are ones that, that let's say that if Romney had won my district by 5, then it would be a bellwether. He didn't. He lived in the district and barely broke even. My district is one of those districts that will be a swing district. As it's currently designed, it really was Brian Bilbray's at one point. So it goes in and out. We could lose it this time, pick it up next time. We might keep it. We have an excellent candidate. But by the way, the Democrats have an excellent candidate. He's young. He's an environmental lawyer who just happened to represent countrywide and defend them when they weren't defendable. So I'd say it's a toss-up.
All right, as I say, I'm in it, Doug. If somebody has a question, because I promised one question, but you have to raise your hand quick because we're going to get to the other congressman in a moment.
Ladies first.
Who has a question? There we go. You get it.
Thank you for that priority. And I'm from San Diego, too, so thank you for that. You've talked about the international theft of technology and what a serious problem it is. Certainly for America, it must be a problem for other countries as well, and it isn't just China that we're worried about. It will be others as well, no doubt. Sure. What are your ideas to solve that problem?
You know, the fact that we don't like, but it really does work, is that bilateral enforcement seldom is the best way to do something. Should we look at multilateral things like the United Nations, like the WTO, and put into these organizations strong protections with agreed on sanctions, and by the way, an arbitration ability if you say I'm not doing it? And the answer is yes. It's slower, but in the long run, that's how we're going to fix it. The challenge we have is that some countries have openly ignored copyright for so long that you have a whole society that doesn't understand that non-tangibles, if you will, intellectual property is property. They don't believe it. And so when you have, you know, I always use Graham Nash. Graham Nash doesn't understand why his songs ever expire and become a property of somebody else. Well, on the internet, nobody understands that he ever had a right to it at all. There's a middle ground. And we need to get governments, if they want to be part of the international trade community, to buy into them. We haven't done a very good job. We've continued to work with countries who ignore it. China just happens to be the whipping boy of today. But when I entered the Army 5 decades ago, Taiwan was who was printing every popular book in paperback as fast as they came out in the US in hardback. They were printed in paperback and they were selling all over Asia. They even did translations of books that didn't have translations. They didn't do them very well, by the way. But they ignored it. Today, Taiwan is pretty darn good on intellectual property protection. But we need to do more than wait for countries to develop and give them an excuse until they do. And you know, that goes across the board. Now, in fairness, this practice that Canada has of saying, I'm only going to pay so much for a pharmaceutical because I'm going to knock it off if you won't sell it to me at my price because I'm going to say you're withholding it. It's not just the undeveloped, but the fully developed world that sometimes plays games. Brazil does the same thing. So I do think that global standards that we participate in and sign on to are important. That's not the direction that I see a lot going on right now. But when you look at where the long-term solution is, it's not sanctions and you know, bilateral behavior. In the long run, we will fix these things by shaming the large developing countries into some sort of a compromise. And I say some sort of a compromise because the reality is they will not sign on if they don't have some reasonable protection from what they would call the withholding of some of this intellectual property. You asked me a question before we went on, and I half answered it, and then we didn't bring it up here. Is America losing its competitive lead? And the answer is America has been losing its competitive lead since the end of World War II, and we've still got a great lead to lose. So for me, I'm excited that the United States will have a competitive lead as long as we don't screw up for the rest of everyone in this room's lifetime. And we will always have somebody who has an easier time grabbing the technology we've already invented, and as a result, always seems to be catching up. But they're always catching up on that which we have already done. And so I'm a big believer that America can continue to be the innovative source for the world just as we are today.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could I welcome Congressman Doug Collins to the stage?
All righty.
All right.
Wow, thanks a lot. I'll never follow you again. Thanks.
Carl County.
Thanks, Daryl. Lisa, yeah.
Our second guest is another Congressman Doug Collins. He's another underachiever. Let's see, double major in poli-sci and criminal justice in college. Master's degree in divinity from Baptist Theological Seminary, New Orleans. Pastor for 11 years at a church in his native Georgia. Then state legislature, law school at night. Oh yes, Air Force chaplain, but you get the point. In Congress, he's part of the GOP leadership, member of the House Judiciary Committee and Rules Committee, and vice chairman of the Subcommittee on Courts, Intellectual Property, and the Internet, which is what we're talking about today. I want to pick up what we were talking about at the end there, patent reform. There's, under the America Invents Act, there's been this tension between the courts and the patent office. The court's sort of more into free speech, the patent office more into business, sort of rough orientation, with Congress trying to strike a balance by not stifling creativity, but representing intellectual property rights. And I want to talk to you about how well you think that's been done.
Okay. Look, I want to continue because I think it's a great discussion to have, and it's one for where we're headed. Whether it's the different parts of what the internet does, the Internet of Things, just the improvisation of patents, but we've also got to look at it from a perspective I think that was hit on that Daryl touched on, and that was first starting with patent quality. And I think we go back to the original thought of what is patent quality and what does that actual patent mean. Is it broad enough to cover what needs to be covered, and is it specific enough to protect, but not broad enough to capture other things that in the end will stifle innovation from somewhere else? I think what you described was an interesting perspective from the perspective of the courts and in perspective of what Congress is trying to do, and then we'll just take the third group out there, not being the courts or Congress, but the stakeholders. And I think there's been the disconnect here in what we're looking at from the perspective of the stakeholders needing, I'm a firm believer. And
you say stakeholders, inventors and investors?
Inventors, investors, the whole ecosystem that brings up and I agree with Daryl that we're still the ones that have first thought, is probably the best way to put it. America is still, I believe, the leader in innovation of first thought. We have that first thought that is then, either we take it or others take it as well. When we look at this, we've got to have strong intellectual property protection, because if you do not have that, you very much lose the creative reasoning, if you would. This is the concern that I think Congress is having, is saying, how do we make sure that there's good creative protection while at the same point giving something that businesses then can use and it not be used against them. That's become the tension more, frankly, on the business side of the house of either am I going to get sued for using something I didn't or did not know was a part of, or in the court system. Instead of focusing basically on what I feel is the better part of it, is focusing on how do we make sure that the protection of the thought, the protection of the creator, the protection of that next big thing is something that is then expanded upon so that we can build upon it and use. That's going to be a difficult.
Let me give you an example. So there was an amendment to the patent law in 2011, and this sort of appeals court set up in the U.S. Patent Office. But there was a case I was going to use originally to show how the internet's so dynamic and helps new business. There's a guy, Josh Malone is his name, father of 8 from Plano, Texas. He invents something that can fill 100 water balloons in 60 seconds. He invents it. He files for patent, gets the patent, launches a Kickstarter campaign, raises $1 million online, and he's off and running. But then somebody, not a Chinese company, another American company just builds the same thing. They reverse engineer it, build it. He goes to the patent office, this appellate court, this appellate body in the patent said, nah, your original patent was too vague. This is the kind of thing that stifles innovation.
It does. Yep.
It doesn't create the incentive.
It does.
So does Congress have to tighten these procedures?
I think we're going to have to, but I think it goes back to, it does have to tighten up procedures in the sense of saying, here is the specific, purpose, here's how we tighten them up and say, this is what we mean by this, and there are real consequences to, as you just said, just coming and taking it over. it has always been a tension, whether you go from and this was something I think, let's take it to the next logical step, and that's value. What is the value of this economy that we're in? What is this value of this sort of theoretical, as we talk about intellectual property, we talk about this out there. And I had a group of attorneys that I was talking to one time out on the West Coast, and they were talking about this issue, that this was becoming the big issue for them, is when they discuss with venture capitalists and others, what is the value of an algorithm? What is the value of this different thing? And they said, after they thought about it for a long time, they finally had to come back and say, this is in essence not new, but what all attorneys do is they say there's a correlation, there's something that we can look at. And they go back almost 125 years to when the titans of, quote, traditional industry were going. You had steel, you had, the U.S. Steel, you had the trains, and really at that time it was the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and others who determined what that value was. Where we're struggling right now is to define that value and say if that value comes from this individual piece, his patent, or does it come from the whole. I think that's the struggle for Congress, because then you have to take into another piece that we really haven't talked about, and that is the schools. That is where some of the best work is being done now. How do they play into this market and protecting their portfolio and getting it to the market, but still having the protections of both? I think that's the struggle for Congress. And it's hard because at another point in time, you also have others who say, well, this is mine, I want to be able to sue for this, or you're doing. So this is, for Congress to simply say, here is X, it's going to be very difficult.
Well, let me bring music into it. So
yes.
I love music. I have Pandora, I have a Spotify account, I have Apple Music, Access, I have even Sirius XM radio because I bought a new car. So I have a vested interest in this next question, but would the proposed Music Modernization Act do what it's intended to do? I mean, I love access to all my music sources, but I don't want to rip off musicians. Have we finally, it's got 73 Senate co-sponsors, but we finally got something that we've figured this out on music?
I believe so. It is some. This is, by the way, Music Modernization Act is the bill that I've been working on. It started off as a Songwriter Equity Act. It's morphed into, with my partner Hakeem Jeffries. Hakeem and I, in the intellectual property space, Hakeem and I have, still going back to the Defending Trade Secrets Act, which you had mentioned something about how do we protect. The Defend Trade Secrets Act is something that's really helped on that trade secret front. That is something Congress has done, and that was our bill. Cloud Act, other things. And Hakeem and I have been working on music for about 5 years now. For those who believe that Congress is a place where, I am so tired of a world in which bumper stickers are the mentality. I am sick of it. Bumper stickers only do one thing. They don't give you an answer, and they make everything sticky on the other side. That's all they do. And they don't help. And what we've got now is everybody just wanting to fix it. It's like, I want my music, I want to download it, I don't want to pay for it, this whole idea. What Music Modernization does is take everybody. We finally got all stakeholders, from digital, the disruptors who gave that ability to take out a phone and listen to music anywhere you want to, instead of like I did when I was growing up. I had to wait for the song to come back on there. Oh, here it is, and you push the cassette tape to maybe catch it so you could listen to it again, if you were too cheap to have 99 cents to go buy the single. For those of you, that's that little thing. Okay, never mind. Anyway, we work on it. So I think what we're getting now is finding that ecosystem that when the disruptors, who at one point were struggling to find that new, dealing with the creative and getting them paid, that's where the balance is struck. And I think what the Music Modernization Act gives us the ability to do is, number one, is have transparency on who owns. That's a big issue that's not talked about a lot. It gives the benefit of who owns the product, lets that then be run through a cooperative that allows them to get paid. And at the end of the day, it keeps us out of court, and instead of Spotify having to spend its time in court trying to fend off suits or pay out big settlement, they're able now just to put the money where it belongs. And I think that's a good thing for both sides.
You mentioned Hakeem Jeffries of New York. He's a Democrat, liberal Democrat. You work with him on another bill I want to ask you about called the First Step Act.
Yes.
This is criminal justice. It's not tech per se, but you dubbed the act the art of the possible. And that got me to thinking, I mean, other things, this bill would expand vocational educational opportunities to federal inmates. But it reminded me of something. We've been talking in the earlier thing we did with Google and today with Darrell Issa about internet access in rural areas and how important it is. But I'm wondering about, it's not a broadband access question per se, but I wonder if there aren't other psychic barriers to using the digital economy in America's inner cities. Is this a problem? Does Congress have a role?
Yeah, I believe they do. And I think here's the issue with this, because broadband and the access, or the ability to access broadband, the access to the internet, we talk about it as a digital divide. Actually, it's a dream divide. I believe truly this is something, this is that next generation of really the dream. And I explain it this way. When I was a kid, for me, my dad was a state trooper. We didn't go a lot of places. He was always working. But I had books, and I had the radio, and I had, so I read and I listened, and it brought the world to me. I was one of those crazy kids that when you were bored, they bought a World Book Encyclopedia, and I'd actually go read. I'd just pick up P and just find out what's going on in the world and learn. Nowadays, my kids who are in the University of Georgia, one's an engineer, one's in political science, they can go literally to their phone and look up anything at that moment. If you don't have that ability, it's now come to the point, especially with the way that the world is developing, there's digital deserts, if you would, in not only, we think about it like in districts like I have. I have a very suburban southern piece, but I have a very agricultural
Northeastern Georgia.
Northeastern Georgia. Right now it looks like where the hurricane is going to end up at the end of the weekend. We don't want it to come visit personally, but if it does, we're in the mountains. So we got a lot of hard connections to make because we have a rural area, but we also have mountains. So we have to look at, digital, the point-to-point spectrums. It doesn't matter. How do we get it there? Because in my district, you can go 20 miles and you're in Atlanta with every access to everything, or you can go 5 miles and not be able to access your own office. For us, working with the broadband economy, working with this, it's one thing we did called a Gigabyte Opportunity Act, in which Chairman Pai has also jumped into. Shelley Moore Capito has it in the Senate.
Ajit Pai, the FCC chairman.
Yes, Ajit Pai has been very supportive of, and saying, look, here's ways that the states, because one thing we don't need is a national, here's what we're going to do at this point, because you're overstepping. I think there's ways that we can help, because frankly.
I want to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is access to broadband and the internet essentially a right for American children? Because if it is, maybe Congress does have a role.
Yeah, I worry about how we throw the word right around. That is my concern there. Is it something that I believe that we should have access to, and there should be, that government, here's my problem. Government should not be the inhibitor in rural areas or urban areas to having access to the ability to get a gigabyte economy.
Right,
and that's where we're at.
But I'm asking, should government require it?
Require it?
You use that phrase, dream divide, in your district.
It is a dream divide, but I think again, my only concern is, without just simply saying, yes, everybody ought to have it, I think from my sort of more small government conservative side, is it ways that we can remove the government equation here and allow it to happen in ways that we have seen in this room, whether it be the internet economy with Google, with others, the digital, the disruptor technology. Let's let them be able to have that technology without government giving an artificial deadline and saying, here's where we're going to do it. I think if we do that, and that's what my Opportunity Act does, it simply says with the state legislatures, the governors, on says, here's the areas where we have a problem. We're going to give you, issue on your capital gains. If you reinvest in broadband, we're going to let you, have divestment. That allows them to go into those areas and do that.
All right, we've got another panel here, so I'm going to open it for questions. And just raise your hand. Somebody will come with a microphone. There's a question here, Zach, Evan, and oh, we got the mic over here? Sorry. Okay.
And we're all open to like SEC football questions.
I got one while we're waiting. So Burt Reynolds, is he still popular, Smoking a Bandit up in your district?
Well,
that was
okay.
what it was.
All right, yeah, I understand.
It's 30 seconds.
For 30 seconds, Smoking the Bandit is not a movie, it's a documentary. It was made in my district, okay? As you go along, you have to understand, also for those, again, very proud of this, in a sense of commercial. Anybody ever seen the movie Deliverance? Remember the young man who played the banjo? He still lives in my district and works at Walmart.
No kidding.
Kid you not. At least that's what I was told last time. He was actually working at Walmart and Home Depot up in Raven County.
In your opinion, what needs to be done to improve the business case for rural broadband deployment, just overall?
The business case for that, I think the biggest thing is going back and how it affects is the concern is making sure that the access is there. And I think the one thing I will say that maybe from a governmental perspective, we've got to make it easier to get like venture capital, and we've got to make sure that there are more direct grant stuff going to that issue. I have a huge problem with the CAF fund, with the Connect America Fund, which only the bigger companies get, and I apologize to anybody, but I've got a company in my Windstream in my area that is absolutely just dropped the ball. They fumbled, they're not working it, they only re-put what they need to into the areas that make them money, then they use the money to go compete with the Comcast and the AT&T of the world. They have failed miserably in my district. They know my feelings, so you don't have to go tell them. They're not real happy with me, and that's fine, because they're failing my people. That's where we got to do a better job in saying, let's do it, let's don't make it where one company can monopolize all the funds. Let's be able to get it to a smaller companies who can do the smaller WISPs, who can do those things that give a point-to-point that they don't have right now. That's where business needs to be from a governmental perspective.
Who else? All right.
Lunch has been really good. And
I'll
everybody's
leave
like,
you
oh.
one thought that this coal miner I keep mentioning, Rusty Justice, he bought a building in Pikesville. And the building he bought, he told us the only reason he bought it because there was a pole out front that had internet. That's why he bought the building. He didn't even look at the building. Oh, this is what I need. That's how essential this is to business development in rural areas.
Well, it can be. Think about it. One of the things I talk about in my area, if you look at my area, it's the north of Georgia, but I've got part of my district is the University of Georgia. I've got the University of North Georgia, where I went to school. You got the new Cyber Center, which is just in Augusta, which is about 60 miles south of where we're at. NSA is there. When you start looking at that, one of the things I tell and Emory and others, and I tell the presidents of these colleges, I said, look, you talk about being, the next business incubators. You want to be that always learning. Until we actually partner with the communities, until you start seeing, like, they always talk about Silicon Valley, these other places, or they talk about Research Triangle in North Carolina. Until you start seeing the professors working 12 hours a day, going home, taking students, and they go home and they get in their garage and then they're making what they're talking about, and you start having this entrepreneurial spirit, which is dependent upon having that issue. Location in rural areas is not about real estate anymore. It's about the access, and that's why we've got to make, whether businesses, whether it be people, having that connection.
All right, last question. Again, we are RealClearPolitics. You're running to be the next House Judiciary Committee chairman?
Yes.
So that's contingent, among other things, on Republicans keeping control of that chamber. I assume
that would be contingent, yeah.
Assume as a former pastor you're not a betting man, but what odds would you give to that proposition?
Well, we have it 5-1 underspread with over 100, but no, I've never bet before. Some of you on the Baptist side will get that. I do dance as well, not well, but I think we do. I think it's going to be tighter as we go forward. I think the interesting issue is, and I travel the country, and that's one of the things that I'm, that's something I want to be as chairman of the judiciary, but right now it's just about keeping the majority for all the stuff that we have been able to do, especially in the intellectual property front. We've done more in the last few years on that front from the Republican majority perspective than had been done in years previous. And this administration, frankly, for whatever you may think, and people do have adult opinions about this administration, the one thing this administration gets is branding, trademark, and intellectual property. The president understands it and his folks do. We're making progress. I think we keep it. It's going to be quiet. Outside of this area, where everybody talks about it in vague terms, it's muddled. But you get out, and I've been in West Virginia, I've been in California, I've been in Washington State, I've been all over in Nevada. Economy, progress, jobs are making a big difference. Is it going to be tight? Yes.
All right. Yes or no question, as they say in the Senate Judiciary Committee, to this question.
So I filibuster.
Yeah. Either way, as chairman of the Judiciary, ranking member, do you expect to be fending off Democrats' attempts to impeach the president in 2019?
I think that's become their choice. They've decided to run on several things that have played to a base that they're continuing to. Yes, I believe that'll be a continuation of their discussion. I think we'll keep majority, so it'll just be their talking point. I think we'll have that. I think what we'll see is, I'm hopeful, at least a small turn after this election when we are able to keep both the House and Senate. We continue that there'll then be a turn maybe in 6 to 8 months or short or longer to the 2020, and maybe it'll be moved toward that.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I hope that you'll join me in thanking the Congressman.
Thank y'all so much. We enjoyed it. Y'all have a good day.
We have a panel coming up. I'm going to go to the lectern and leave you with one thought about another congressman, a Democratic congressman, while they're setting up. So if you have to leave, go ahead. If not, I'm going to tell you a story about Al Gore. When I came to Washington well, I don't want to tell you when. Some of you weren't born yet. But when I came, it was the 80s. And my home paper was the San Jose Mercury News, as I mentioned. And we covered the Silicon Valley. Now, I grew up there, and it was then mostly orchards. It was called, the Chamber of Commerce phrase was the Valley of the Heart's Delight. The phrase Silicon Valley had not yet been coined. But when I got here, it had been, and there were only a few congressmen who knew anything about it. You'll notice these two members that we had today and other members we've had in the past, there are plenty of people in Congress who know a lot about digital technology and digital economy and care about it. And I made fun of Warren Hatch earlier, but that's actually the exception, not the rule. But when I was in the 80s, there was nobody from my district, Norman Mineta and Don Edwards, these great old guys, I loved them, but they weren't techies. And but there was one guy who was interested in this. His name was, we called him Albert Gore Jr. then. And Al Gore was a former newspaper man, and I used to go by his office and talk to him just to shoot the breeze about technology stuff. And one day I went in there, and Al Gore said, "Hey, Carl, I've just come back from DARPA, and there's this thing." I said, "Well, what is it?" He says, "I don't even know what to call it, but what they're calling it is the information superhighway." I said, "Well, what is that?" He said, "Do you have computers in your office?" We did, because we got them from Stanford, which was just up the road where they were inventing this stuff. And he says, "Do you have messages?" And, "Yeah, we can send messages." He says, "You'll be able to send messages like outside your office." I said, "Come on." He said, "Yeah." He said, "You'll be able to sit down at your computer and get any book at the Library of Congress." I remember that was, he said, "And if you're looking up tigers and it's a school experiment, you could see a picture of a tiger. Maybe they'll even have sound." So he said all this. I'd never heard of it. No one I knew had heard of it. I called my home paper, and I said, "So what about this? What did the business people say about this?" And they said, "We've never heard of this. Could you write us a memo?" And I wrote them a memo. They took the memo. It's about what I just told you, and they stripped it across page 1 the next day. Al Gore says, "Information superhighway has been invented." And I thought of that I covered Gore when he ran for president. A lot of people made fun of him when he said, "I was instrumental in creating the internet," and that wasn't exactly right. But if Al Gore had said, "I was the first person in Congress who ever heard of it, I was an early adapter, and I passionately tried to help it," he would have been right. So in that sense, Al Gore was an early adopter. With that, I'm going to introduce our president, Erin Waters. She's going to bring her panel up, and you're going to introduce your panel.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Erin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Waters, president of RealClearPolitics. In my session, we're going to dig in a little bit about the examples, how the future of industry is looking, how the policy prohibits or helps it along, and some examples from the local community. So I'd like to invite my panelists up to the stage, please. Great. To my right, I have Robert Atkinson, the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. To his right is Diane Katz, senior research fellow at the Institute of Economic Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. To her right, Stephen Rosenbusch, or just Steve. Steve, editor at the CIO Journal with the Wall Street Journal. And then lastly, Mark Jameson, a professor at University of Florida, and he is a visiting fellow at AEI. Thank you all for being here. We touched on this briefly in the earlier discussions, but what we want to talk about is traditional industry has changed. Technology has advanced and moved it along. We want to make some predictions about the future, what we think that holds for these industries, who's benefited, who's been hindered, and then the policies that might help it along. I'd like to start with Mark. Give us kind of the broad overview. Walk us through technology and how it has revolutionized industry or telecommunications specifically, which you know, and do it quickly decade by decade.
Okay, so sure.
Easy one.
Yeah. Well, I identify 4 or 5 kind of different things that are kind of milestones along the way. I go clear back to about 1970. That's when cellular technology was first made commercially viable. We didn't get it used in the United States for over another decade, but that was a game changer for the world and what was going to happen in telecommunications. Then I roll the clock forward again to about 1981, 82. That's when the IBM PC came out. That changed how people were going to use computing. There was the Apple II before that, but it was the IBM PC that really made the change. Then you go to 1993. That's when Mosaic came out. Mosaic took the internet from something that was nice for using email, maybe some file transfers, to something that changed people's lives. Each of these along the ways were not so much creating a new technology, but making the technology something that changed people's lives. The last one would have been the iPhone, iPod, 1981, 1987, I believe, excuse me, I got that wrong, 2001, 2007. Each one of these is taking about 10 to 15 years. So we're ripe for something else. Again, it's not going to be a new technology that knocks people's socks off, but someone taking things like what we're seeing with blockchain, artificial intelligence, et cetera, and putting those into people's hands in a ways that no one has imagined and changing people's lives again.
Excellent. I should say, we have our viewership. We're live streaming this event, and we usually see about 10,000 people that tune into it. So we're a much larger group than who's in the room. So some of the questions I might ask you to kind of explain down the road for those that are elsewhere in the country. Robert, what are your thoughts on what Mark had to say? And Can you talk a little bit about your take on it?
Yeah, no, I agree with Mark that technology tends to go in these phases, or 10-year periods, let's say. And I think we are poised for another phase. I've termed that phase the CAS phase, CIS. I think there's three big things happening in technology now. One is connectivity. Just things are going to be connected that we could never connect before. We're going to connect billions and billions of devices from the soil sensors in a farmer's field to we'll be wearing wearable devices that sensors. The second is autonomy or automation. I put those together. We're going to have autonomous systems. We're going to have trains that are going to be running on their own or with a lot fewer people. We're obviously autonomous trucks. But automation, that's I think a really big thing. We're going to have robotic technology get a lot better. And the third, and it all relates, all inter together, is smart systems or intelligent systems, largely through AI, and that's going to embed. Now, I think what's different about today and in the past, my colleague David Moschella at Leading Edge Forum has a good analogy where he says that the tech industry historically has been arms merchants. So you can go to an Oracle or an IBM or whatever, and you can buy what you need to build your company and do better. And you're going to use that tech. Now he's saying the technology industry is an invading army. So if you look at Silicon Valley, many, many firms in Silicon Valley are their business models are not about to give you a better database. They're about going in and disrupting your industry. So they're disrupting healthcare, transportation, logistics, financial services, education, you name it. So I think that's really the interesting thing. And I think it's going to happen in one of three ways. Either it'll be the big companies like Google's doing autonomous vehicles. It'll be small new companies that come out. Uber would be a good example of that 10 years ago. Or it will be incumbent companies that figure out that if they don't respond and transform their own businesses, that in Clay Christensen's terms, somebody else is going to do it for them.
Absolutely. Stephen, as the editor of the CIO Journal, you've had the opportunity to cover growth and evolution in key industries that have been reindustrialization that is happening across the country due to technology. We talked a little bit about what those different industries have been. Can you walk us through a bit of that and what you've seen and what that ties into the predictions for the future?
Sure. What we've been reporting on for the last 7 years feels like an increasingly significant change in business, and I think that we're seeing the transfer of technology, certainly from the tech sector in Silicon Valley into almost every other industry or business in the economy. But at the same time, along with that technology, there's a lot of change in process and business model that goes along with it. So companies are changing the way that they do business, and above and beyond everything else, there's an enormous amount of cost that's being ripped out of many, many businesses. And there are a lot of new things happening, and it's extremely volatile.
Diane, you have done some work on energy specifically. We talked about kind of the policy shaping it. What have you seen in your work, and what do you see that affecting the future?
Well, if I may,
yeah,
I just want to pick up on a couple things that some of the other panelists had said. In terms of I cover regulation largely, and your comment about AT&T and us not getting the technology for another 10 years, as well as the invading army content, really connect into the regulatory policy debate, because on the one hand, we were delayed in getting cellular technology in large part because AT&T had a sanctioned monopoly by the government, and the competitive field was really dampened. And then in terms of the invading army, what we know about regulation is that it always benefits the incumbents, and so the biggest companies are going to have the abilities to come in and raid other companies because they have the resources to do so. I mentioned to Aaron, energy, because that's one area where there's been a lot of implementation of different technology, in particular in energy efficiency and so on. And it's a good case study in how regulation can drive innovation and technology, because so much was committed to one goal, which was to reduce, carbon emissions. And there is a lot to look at there in terms of what hasn't been done and what has, because regulation skews investment decisions, it drives specific types of technology to the detriment of other types of technology, and it also produces a lot of unintended consequences. So, for example, there's lots of incidents of biofuel or corn-based ethanol or solar panels, unintended consequences, negative effects on the environment. So basically, I'm here, all of which is to say, I'm here just to bring some attention to, how government is allowed to interfere with technological development. Because what we really do know is that standardization, which is essentially what regulation is in many ways, is an enemy of innovation. And so if we want to get certain things done through public policy, we should be looking at optimum ways that downplay regulation for other methods.
We talked a bit about, and this ties into a little what you said, but Mark, in the prior session, they talked a bit about the entrepreneurial spirit, and we've chatted about that as well. Can you talk about the U.S. versus Europe and where you think that has been a benefit for us?
Yeah, there's a really interesting study out of the European Union a few years ago looking at Europeans' attitudes towards entrepreneurship versus having a job and comparing it a little bit to the U.S. And it's fascinating the outcome they found. They found that almost 60% of Europeans would prefer to have a job in an established company than start or run one. Over half of Americans feel just the opposite, would rather start and run a company than be employed by one. The number of Europeans at the time the study was done that wanted to start a company was about 35%, and the trend was downward. Where in the US, you look at that trend is probably, the study didn't say this, but anecdotally, the trend to me appears to be upward in that regard. So there's just I'm happy to let them make the choices they're making in Europe. They're just not the choices I would want to make. I think a vibrant economy that's willing to destroy something that was nice in the past but isn't part of the future and build something new for the future is an economy I like to be part of.
I'm going to build on that for both Steve and for Robert. Can you talk a little bit about what you are seeing across the country? What communities are kind of sprouting up with different or new ideas?
Well, I actually have literally seen quite a bit across the country in the last few weeks. I dropped my son off at college, and my wife and I went on a 5,500-mile road trip. And we saw 20 some odd states in about 2 weeks. And one of the things that we talked to a fair number of people, and one of the things that we kept hearing over and over again is that things are so different here than they were 3 years ago. That's true. It was true in Pittsburgh, true in Fargo, North Dakota, true in towns in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and it's a completely anecdotal, report, completely unscientific, but talking to people who've been in the same place for a few years gave me the sense that there's a lot of activity and a lot of change, a lot of development happening in many places because there's a lot of technology and cheap energy filtering into these places, and that you're seeing a revival in a lot of industries.
So there was just a Washington Post story on Monday or Tuesday, if people saw it, about the revival of blue-collar jobs in the U.S. And I think what's interesting about that, I think one of the reasons we've seen a revival of blue-collar jobs is for the first time we've seen essentially manufacturing productivity grow at the same, if not slower rate than non-manufacturing productivity growth. That's never really happened in American history before. So when we have an expansion of the economy, we're going to see more jobs in blue collar because they're not raising their productivity enough. So I think where we are in this phase, I think there's an awful lot of, our minds are ahead of reality in this space because everybody thinks, oh, man, AI, it's here. I'm going to be, the next car I get 2 years from now, it's going to drive itself, and my phone's going to be able to do all these amazing things. I don't know if you ever tried to use, some of the AI stuff, but it's, not very good. But the point is, it's going to get better. And this is to Mark's point about it. It's sort of like, I think, equivalent to cellular, sort of, maybe we're at 2.5G when we need to be at 4. I think that's where we are with this technology. Now, I'm 100% convinced that we're going to get there. And as we get there, we're going to be transforming farms. I was reading something the other day. When farmers used to have to go down their field and plow a field, or, fertilize a field, or seed a field, they would have to have a foot-long overlap. So they essentially seed the same thing twice or put the same fertilizer down twice. And now, because of precision farming, they have a 1-inch overlap. And we're just going to see that sort of thing. Interesting thing now, there's 170,000 farmers in the US who sell directly now to consumers. Wow. And a lot of, and by the way, interesting, the number of those are veterans. There's a higher share of women farmers now who sell directly to consumers. And that's all enabled by technology. And we're going to see that in manufacturing. We're going to see it in logistics. We're going to see it in construction. We're going to see it in a wide array of industries. And so in that sense, what's happened over the last 20 to 30 years is we've had these spots in the country where the tech industry, if you will, the tech arms dealers, have done quite well. You know, they've done quite well on the East Coast. They've done quite well on the West Coast. That's where they're headquartered. That's where everybody is. I think what we're going to see is this movement internal into the country, if you will, because the use of this is going to be so much broader than it has been in the past.
Steve, is there anything you want to add on that?
Yes, I mean, I think that I agree completely. A few weeks ago, I spoke to Thomas Tull, who is a producer in Hollywood. He'd produced 300 and The Dark Knight, and decided to have a change of career, and he moved back to Pittsburgh. And now he's investing in AI with an idea toward transforming more abundant industries. So he's doing this in medical scrubs. I don't know how he's actually applying AI to the medical scrubs business, but he says he is. But also in waste hauling, you know, and they're using AI in one case to find excess trucking capacity. Completely changes the economics of that business, makes it a lot more efficient, probably reduces maybe some jobs in the short term and medium term, but over the long term, you know, there's a lot of activity and growth.
Can you give a little bit of a 101 on blockchain for anybody out there that doesn't quite know the lingo and what it means?
Okay, well, blockchain is essentially what we call a distributed ledger. Explain what that means. So you think about how the banking system has worked over time. If you wanted to make a wire transfer to some other part of the world, you went through a system called the SWIFT system. There was a single point where everything would go through, and it measured, and it took time, and it's rather expensive to use. Blockchain takes that centralized system and has software that takes care of that entire function. And so when you're sending something from one bank or one individual to another in another part of the world, the blockchain just keeps track of the transaction. It says, yes, this dollar, this euro, whatever now belongs to this person over here. It's distributed in that no one controls it. It's supposed to be. It depends on who does it. The ledger spread across thousands, sometimes millions of computers around the world. And if you want to destroy that system, you have to get to all those computers. You can't simply destroy the one central computer in one place. So that's what blockchain does for it. It distributes that transaction ledger, whatever it might be, across a lot of computers. So the central work is done by the software as opposed to a group of people.
Diane, have you done any work or research or read up on these new technologies that are emerging?
I'm not an expert on the new technologies, but I can talk a little bit about what will help and what will hinder the new technologies. So in terms of this notion or this idea of, you know, the increasing spread inward of technological adoption and application, that is a good example of why regulation, you know, can be problematic, because as technology moves faster than government can possibly move, any rules are effectively obsolete or out of date by the time that the new technology is moving somewhere else. And so we have to be very careful, I think, about what kinds of rules that we put in place. There are ways to regulate better, and there are ways to regulate worse. And What we want to make sure that we do in cases where we do need regulation is to regulate the outcome, not the technology for getting there. Also to regulate for actual effects, that is, what are going to be the impacts and the consequences, rather than on the basis of our aspirations. And then also to devolve, as much as we can, regulation to the those who actually know, the people on the ground who actually know how technology works, how it affects local governments, and rather than there being a centralized authority here in Washington who can't really account for the vast variety that there is across the United States. And finally, that we incentivize rather than punish. And so those, I would say, are the primary points of good regulation.
Steve, I have a quick question for you, Steve. Sure. We were talking about automation and what's going on in the market and what's at work. What have you seen, and what is the current reaction, if there is one, to how it's going?
I think it varies from industry to industry. I think there's a lot of concern in areas where people's lives are obviously at stake. There's a lot of anxiety about automation when it comes to driving, although maybe not as much as we think. There's some anxiety about loss of jobs, which is legitimate because there will be a lot of loss of jobs, even if there's creation down the road. But there's also this incredible application of automation in areas that people don't know about or think about. We did a story the other day on Chevron, which is beginning to connect all of its industrial equipment at the refinery level with sensors that allow it to connect a lot of data and will allow it to automate an enormous amount of process. You're starting to see automation in the retail sector in a really big way. Prototypes of stores in which there are no people behind the cash register. We can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's happening. And you can see the same thing happening all across the grocery sector and the retail sector.
So Mark and Robert, you can't talk about automation and the job issue without talking about people and skills in the future. I would like you to talk a little bit what you've written about you can't talk about industry growth without talking about the people. And I'd love for Robert to kind of weigh in on where you think kind of the skills will be needed, what you're seeing out on that side.
Yeah. I'll talk about it outside the skills space. And it's about people changing and adapting themselves. I direct a research center at the University of Florida. Our work is going around the world and helping countries become world-class experts in their infrastructure policies. They become the experts they need rather than have a consultant come in and try to tell them what to do. One of the things we discovered early on in this work is that countries could get the economics, the law, the engineering, the accounting, get all those things right, and still their systems would fall apart. And we wondered why, and we're a bunch of economists. That really confused us. What we discovered was that sometimes we were asking cultures and people to change too much too fast. So they could look at another country and say, yes, private provision of a utility service worked over there. Having people who didn't actually just bow to the prime minister worked over there, but this is our country. We're comfortable in this space. It doesn't work real well, but we're used to it. And helping people be able to let go of something that they are comfortable with and helping them see what the future should look like. That is the work of getting the people right. So we actually, a bunch of us are economists, we actually hired someone to be our director of leadership studies, who very specifically works with people saying you're in this incredibly intensely political environment. How can you help people adapt and embrace a new future in that kind of a context where mistakes are not tolerated?
So just quickly, by the way, on the blockchain thing, we just started a series 2 weeks ago where every Monday we come out with a new 2-pager on emerging tech. So we did AI, we just did 5G on Monday, and blockchain is coming up in 2 weeks if people are interested in seeing that. So it's a really easy thing to understand these technologies. On the skills component, I 100% agree that we're going to have more disruption. Right now, actually, disruption is the lowest we've had since the Bureau of Labor Statistics has recorded it in 1995. So the odds of losing your job today through no fault of your own are the lowest they've ever been. That doesn't mean those aren't going to go back up, because they are going to go back up, and more industries and occupations are going to be disrupted by new technologies. What I worry about is that our politics is unbelievably unprepared to do that, and the reason I say that is I believe you have a bunch of folks on the left side of the aisle who say, we really don't want this, that no job loss is acceptable in the economy. It is too harmful and hurtful to people, so we're going to resist automation. We're going to resist this as much as we can because we don't want to hurt anybody. Now, the problem with that is you cannot get wage growth without productivity growth. You just cannot do it. And we've had stagnant wage growth because we haven't had strong productivity growth in a decade. On the conservative side, you hear a lot of arguments about this is some really important technology and we need to get government out of the way, which, by the way, I agree with. But if that's all we do and all these people are hurt and upset, they're going to push back politically. So we have to do a much better job of preparing people for these transitions. Good example would be right now in higher education, 32% of college seniors in their second semester are fully numerate. 39% are fully literate. College seniors, and only, what, 40% of people have college degrees. So we're really doing just a bad job of preparing people. And then secondly, if you lose your job in the US today from a technology dislocation, and you try to say, what are my skills? What do I need? Where should I go in terms of my career? How would I find out the skill training programs in my area? You cannot do that. And the public training system in the US has basically failed us on that. Now, there's a couple of really interesting projects that LinkedIn and Microsoft are doing in Colorado, and the big banks are doing in New York to help this. But we just have to make this better.
What are they doing specifically?
Well, you go to this thing in New York City where the big banks, along with a group called the Council on Adult Experiential Learning, have created this incredible web tool. You can go on this and you can, first of all, get a skills assessment that says if you want to get into the financial services industry, these are the things that you're kind of missing. Oh, and by the way, here are the actual courses or community colleges or other things like that. Here's how to enroll in them. Click the button, you can get enrolled. And then it's also, here's how to get on the job list for these banks so that they'll hire you. Super easy, super intuitive. It's kind of like, you know, Amazon Prime for this kind of thing. The rest of the system is like using DOS.
Right.
Can I just add
please jump in.
Quick point to relate what we're talking about up here to what was discussed earlier about urban areas and the lack of I think it was called the dream, what did you call it? The dream chasm or something like that. In any event, you know, I'm from Detroit, so I can speak to this personally. And I'm a product of the Detroit public school system, but a long time ago. And so, but what I can say with, you know, certainty is that if you are a product today of the Detroit public school system, you are at a deficit educationally and in terms of workforce readiness that it's virtually impossible to make up. Basically, you come out and you can't read, can't do mathematics, don't know anything about civics. But you know, I mean, there are some things that you would know about that are good in the political realm, but not necessarily in the academic realm. I think we have to address public education and the public education monopoly because it's clearly not working, and bring more choice, just as we want choice and competition in technology, and we see the benefits of that in technology. We need to do the same thing with education.
I want to take a quick temperature before we keep talking. Are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Can we get a microphone over here?
It's the dream divide.
Dream divide.
Dream divide. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi. Prefaced with, I am not an economist, but I am a technologist. Can you think a little bit about what all this connectivity, ubiquitous connectivity, and AI and all these advances in technology will do to either lessen or exacerbate business cycles and the impact that has on people?
Who wants to take it?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about the turnover in the S&P 500. It's accelerated over the last few decades, and it's going to accelerate more. I don't know exactly when the complete the turnover is likely to occur, but it's going to be probably twice as fast as the last turnover. And I think, in a sense, that's kind of a business cycle of sorts. Even if the larger business cycle is moving at a different pace, the turnover within individual businesses and individual industries appears to be accelerating and relentless.
I think that I can't tell you if it's how it's going to affect the actual cycle, but I can imagine that technology will enable industry sectors to anticipate and prepare for changes in the business cycle, to adapt to it, and to recover from it. And so, in some senses, if the model continues, that is the speed up of technology in history, we may see a flattening out in some respects, or at least smaller blips in the business cycle. But that's just sort of off the top of my head.
And Diane's exactly right. The adaptation is the key. I saw a survey recently that over 60% of the big data artificial intelligence projects in major companies fail. They don't fail because they don't get the technology right, it's because the executives look at the outcome and say, I don't want to do that. And that's the human part of I'm unwilling to change. Right. Of course, what happens in that is that another business says, I'm willing to change, and it steps into that marketplace. So arc of the business cycle per se, that's really hard to tell. The adaptation on the individual level is the key.
I just say the last two business cycle downturns have been related to sort of over-exuberance. Historically, business cycle downturns were partly, if not largely, related to inventory issues. And in theory, you should have that be much, much less. Inventory is going to be much leaner, much smarter. You're not going to produce things you don't need. I mean, as we go to 3D printing, for example, that's going to work in that direction. I would just say, I don't even think that's the most important question. I think we focus way too much on the business cycle. And how many people follow the quarterly BLS productivity releases on Friday? One person? Yeah, thank you.
We got two.
Yeah, we need to talk. The single most important statistic that the US government comes out with, and reporters don't cover it, nobody covers it. And that's really what's important. If we can get US productivity to grow from its sort of anemic 1.2% up to perhaps 3 or 4%, which I think is possible, that means that in a decade, our incomes are going to go up 50%. That's a huge transformation of the US economy. And that is a huge transformation of sort of how we feel. Because if we all knew that our incomes were going up to 50% in 10 years, we'd all be really happy.
Are there any other questions? Yes, right here. Wait 1 second, the microphone's coming.
Hi, my name's Terry Pfeiffer, and one of the things that I do is I'm president of the federal chapter of the Government Blockchain Association, so I appreciate the shout outs for blockchain. I have a question. So and I want to string together a couple of things that you mentioned and a couple that you didn't, but there's I would say a fervent interest in blockchain just due to the market, not so much anymore, but around Bitcoin. And then some folks have talked about the migration of technology startups in particular out of the Valley, more into the Midwest. And then there's also this emerging competition between the states in terms of trying to create crypto-friendly or blockchain-friendly, or just to generalize it, technology-friendly legislation to, again, bring those companies to locate there. And then there's also this fairly recent legislation around opportunity zones. And so I'm just curious, is anyone looking at leveraging some of these different things that are happening in a way to create more exponential outcomes?
I can speak only to the part about offering abatements, be they tax abatements or other types of abatements from states and local communities, hoping to lure, companies. It sets up I don't think it's good either for states or for companies, because it sets up and sort of cements, the performance of the company, and usually they don't really work, and the cost per job created is generally huge. Companies should be going to places that are going to help their bottom line and improve their productivity and not be lured by, tax abatements that, don't provide much bang for the buck, so to speak.
I would chime in that entrepreneurs certainly are looking at it. I have a former student of mine out in Silicon Valley, and he invited me to come out and just kind of hang out. So my wife and I went out. Over just the 2 or 3 days they were there, we probably participated in 10 different discussions with groups of entrepreneurs saying, what can we do with blockchain? And so they're really trying to figure out what they can take this technology and do something that better than's been done before or that's never been done before. So certainly the entrepreneurs are all over it, and that's happening all over the world. But it's the clusters of those conversations. It's hard to create a cluster. It's going to be there, those like minds working together. They are paying a great deal of attention to what is being done in this town. And so some of them are indeed moving their operations overseas because they see too much regulation, whether it's in the cryptocurrency space, which they're largely using as trying to raise capital. It's not really creating the next Bitcoin, it's capital formulation. Or just how they would be regulated and how they would conduct their business. So it's not a kind of something where you would say, well, go and do whatever you can. It's to say, how do we keep the rules of the old economy from stifling what is really showing up as opportunities that could not be created with as much regulation as we have today in the traditional structures.
Well, I'll just throw one example. One thing governments can do if they want to be friendly towards blockchain is they could use blockchain to transform their own operations. And you think about, for example, probably one of the least value-added things we have in the economy is title search and title insurance. When we all buy a house, are you kidding me? You have to search? And why is that? It's because governments haven't made those things with an open API. And now with blockchain, you could put all titles and then any deeds and liens and all that. It could all go on an open blockchain. And then when you buy a house, you don't have to pay that $400 or whatever it is for title search. You can just eliminate that waste from the US economy. And if governments did that, they would send a message that they are also very open to blockchain innovation.
I'm going to free ride on that comment because it also is a illustration of why we don't want government to be, that is so behind in technological adaptation to be making the decisions about what everybody else should be doing and not doing.
Any other questions? So in closing, I'd like each of you to just kind of give your prediction of what you think is really going to be the emerging big thing and the impact that we should watch for. Let's start with you.
So I start?
Yes.
Keeping in the spirit of what Diane was saying earlier about outcomes, I'm not going to focus on the outcome. I'm going to focus on my optimism for the process. I think there's a great opportunity for us to take our government system and move it, shrink it down in terms of its control so that people have greater freedom to choose. Because the path forward is very uncertain. We'll have a lot more failures than we have successes. But that process works best when people can try things like Teddy Roosevelt said about the person in the arena that dares greatly and fails. But that's the only way that you have successes, is to let the people try.
I would say that it's early and it's late enough to say with some conviction that AI will transform almost every industry that we're involved in between now and say 2030. Is that too far ahead?
That's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, 2030 is good. And Diane, I'll let you just make your recommendation for what you hope for, since you're not such an industry.
Okay. Well, I think I ran down some of the properties of better regulation, but there's two things that I do want to focus on. One is what worries me the most, and it's in the near term probably more than in the far into the future, is this drive to control content. And I worry that government is going to, unlike controlling smokestacks and drain pipes, effects that have, public health and safety repercussions, you know, regulating ideas is a much more dangerous concept. And so I think we need to all be very aware of the extent to which that threat lingers.
I would say plastics. But some people haven't seen The Graduate, so yeah. Although, given that my son is finishing up a computer science degree this year and he's specializing in AI, I'm like the happiest dad in the world because I'm like, he's going to get a job. I think it's going to be AI related, but let me actually drill down one level under that. And I think it's AI-enabled autonomous systems and robotics. I just think that's going to be so transformative. It's going to be able to do so much for us. You know, you're going to go into McDonald's and the hamburgers are going to be made by a thing. And if you want to order them, then there'll be a little robotic cart that'll come out and deliver it to you. What I find troubling is that the US, many countries have national R&D initiatives for robotics. We do, and we spend a massive $50 million at National Science Foundation, which is an order of magnitude less than what it should be. And what's worse is that R&D, that research that goes to university scientists, the researchers cannot use that money to build robots that replace workers. They can only use it for what are called supplemental or cobots. And I like cobots too, but I think it's a big, big mistake. I think we should just be exploring those fields and then really do a lot more to help workers. So I think that's a big deal. I look at places like San Francisco, and this is your point. San Francisco there are two main companies in the US that build these little pizza delivery robots. Have you seen these in DC? They're really cool. One of them's in San Francisco in sort of this, you know, rundown, you know, working class place. They employ mostly minority workers as technicians to build these things, and yet the city of San Francisco has banned sidewalk delivery robots. Because you never know, something might happen. Good.
With that, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, panelists, for your time and preparation.
Thank you.
Thank you.